One of the questions I'm asked the most often is what was the inspiration for the book? And I honestly, my answer is I don't really remember. I had an idea for a setting, which was I was thinking about after, say today for an example, after 2 or 3 days where it's gray or it's rainy, how much of an effect that can have on your psyche, how depressing that can be, how much that can make you feel lost. And I thought, what if there was a world where that's the way things were at all times? What would that place be like? How would it affect people? So I set out to write a short story. Came up with a protagonist, came up with a few little bits of action and dialogue, and pretty soon I realized I've just written 20,000 words here after a few days, so I thought, okay, well this is clearly going to be a novel. I took a few tentative steps down the street, then stopped in the middle of the broad boulevard. There had to be a catch. No way I was on my own. I reread the letter twice. Free to do as I please? Choice? What the f*** was I going to do? They were playing with me. He was. I had expected inquisition, or execution, or at the very least imprisonment. This was far worse. Trapped but free, just as I had been for 15 years, but this time, with the knowledge that there was more out there, and that I was anything but in control. Really, you guys are all storytellers when you think about it. Whether you had a fine night and you tell your friend about it the next day, you're telling them a story. Or whether you sit there alone and you think of something that you think is interesting that's never happened, you sit down and you write what's called a totally unoriginal story. That can teach people things too, and it can be a lot of fun, and also it's interesting. Okay, what's your favorite thing about Harry Potter? It has, what's that? It has violence. Okay, that's important. Unfortunately, that's important. There's a lot of that, and you have to address these things. And that's actually a good point, because that's something I wanted to talk about, is part of the reason stories are so important, and part of the reason I like writing them myself, is because sometimes it's not easy to talk about things, but it's important to talk about things. And that's a perfect example. So sometimes maybe you've had a bad day, or you just think you know that something's happened in history of people, and you don't know exactly how to talk about it, because it's uncomfortable, because it makes you sad, or it makes you scared, but you can write a story about it, and that makes it a little bit easier to deal with.
When you're working on a character, I'm guessing that the character starts to take on a life that's a little bit independent of you.
Yes.
In a sort of strange way, but
Yes.
How did that happen in this case? Did you see him evolving and changing?
Yeah, with this protagonist, what I basically did is I made him someone who would be sort of like me if everything had gone wrong. So I would sort of think, okay, it's 15 years from now, your life is falling apart, you live in a terrible place. And I'd sort of think, okay, if this situation came up, what would be sort of the wrong way to respond? And very often I would say, okay, well that's what this guy's going to do, because he's a down and out kind of broken character thrust into the situation. So a lot of times he says and does things that make you cringe, because he's sort of this anti-hero who has to learn that he's got to change his behavior if he wants to make anything better of himself. And I'll often think of specific individuals and definitely draw pieces from them. But I think a lot of it, at least for the protagonist, definitely is thinking of myself, picturing how would I react in the wrong way if all of this sort of just sort of went to hell.
So is setting just as important as characters
In this book, yes. In general, I would say no, because if you put an interesting character, you think about like My Dinner with Andre, I think if you have an interesting character, they can be in a blank room or they can be, on a submarine, it doesn't matter. But also without a good setting, a story is not going to be compelling. So I think ultimately, I would say character is more important, but I think the fusion of the two is important. Because this character, Tom Vale, the protagonist, not in this world, would just be a boring, lonely alcoholic, which is not compelling. But in this world, I think he becomes the everyman because of the situation, because he knows how to navigate that sort of down and out underground sort of world. And thank you all very sincerely for being here, because this is a very important